Well, thank
please.
you very much for that introduction, Mary. I'm very sorry I can't be with you actually up in Auckland because I have to say it's horribly wet and cold down here. So even though it would be just a very short presentation for a long trip, it is truly ghastly down here at the moment. So I hope you're all nice and warm. And I have to say you have a much nicer venue than I do. So I'm quite jealous of that as well. So I do have two organisations to work for. Murfield Agronomy is clearly my own company. The BHU Future Farming Centre is part of the BHU Organics Trust, the charitable trust that runs the 10-hectare organic unit at Lincoln University. It is a separate legal entity, so it's separate from the university for complicated political reasons. So I kind of mostly work in these small organisations. So, a quick roadmap for where we're going to go this evening. I want to briefly explain what soil health is to make sure we're all clear on that. And then I use this metaphor of the three-legged stool of soil health: chemical, physical, biological, and increasingly we're thinking about how energy flows through soil. Then the kind of guts of the article that was in the New Zealand Gardener. There's been a massive revolution, a paradigm change, as they call it in the trade, in the soil science, particularly soil biology, around the formation of soil organic matter, and therefore
Right.
what drives soil health. And then we'll finish off with some practical tips for what it takes to actually.
Okay.
What is soil health? There's a huge amount of argument in soil science over the years about whether there even is such a thing as soil health, let alone what it is and how we should measure it. But down at the kind of slightly more grounded level, this isn't a difficult thing to understand. It's basically the same as eye health. Are you fit? Do you exercise regularly? Eat lots of healthy green leafy food? All those kinds of things. Or do you sit on the couch watching footy, eating pies? It's not a complicated thing. It's basically how your soil would be working, functioning as it would under natural vegetation. So that's the kind of the baseline we've got here. And there's everything to like about healthy soils. It does everything soils should do. They're more robust and resilient to shocks such as flooding and drought. Rain gets into them faster, so there's less chance when we do have lots of rain of getting overland flow of the flooding occurring. You've got more waters and nutrients stored in the soil, and because of all of that flowing on, we cause less water pollution. And unhealthy soil is very unsurprisingly basically all of those things backwards. If you don't have healthy soil, your plant growth is going to be poor. You're going to cause contamination, pollution of rivers and streams. In the commercial environment, that's going to result in reduced profit for farmers and growers. You're going to lose that soil, and so it's just kind of really bad all round. So what we want is healthy, not unhealthy soil. So I refer to, and many other soil scientists kind of break soil health down into three main components: physical, chemical, and biological. And increasingly, we're looking also at the flow of energy through soil and how it holds all these three together. Excuse me. Now, I love a good three-legged stool metaphor, and the three-legged stool metaphor is absolutely perfect for soil science. We've got the physical, chemical, and biological or slash ecological legs. And then energy is kind of a bit like the seat that holds the three legs together. Now, the key thing with a three-legged stool is if one of those legs is a bit short and you try and compensate by making the other leg shorter or the same length, then you have a lower stool. So your overall health has decreased. You also can't compensate by making the two legs the two legs that are not so short longer, because then you have a very wonky stool. It's out of balance. So the metaphor is that all three legs are supporting each other, and all three legs have to be equal to be able to give you good overall soil health. So you simply cannot compensate. If you've got poor chemical soil health, you can't increase your biological activity to try and compensate. It doesn't work like that. And here we have the compulsory picture of unhealthy and healthy soils. So this is from Lincoln University. This is a silt loam. It's a Templeton to be precise. The spade on the left there is taken from underneath a fence line. It's permanently vegetated with pasture. It's nice and dark and crumbly, and there's lots of roots and earthworms. And literally just a couple of meters away from underneath the tracks where all the vehicles drive, exactly the same soil, little covering vegetation. It's pale, it's big and blocky and clumpy, and we can find few roots and earthworms in it. So that's your kind of typical picture of good and healthy soil. So we'll start with the soil physical health. And soil physical health is principally around whether the soil has good structure. We talk about aggregation. So aggregates are the kind of building or the bricks that build up a soil. And typically they should be mostly fairly small. Think the consistency of muesli, or perhaps even better, granola. So you should have lots and lots of little small crumbs. And we often talk about nice crumbly aggregated soil. And as you can see from the pictures here from Graham Shepherd's visual soil assessment booklet, the soil on the left is nice and healthy. It's mostly that granola sized with a few slightly bigger sized aggregates at the top. The middle one's kind of getting considerably less healthy. You've got some really big blocks at the top, and the one on the right is clearly kind of mostly big clods, you know, big hard pieces of soil, and there's very little air getting in those. So soil structure should be like a sponge. It literally should be about 50% pore spaces. And what we mean by pores are continuous tubes. And we're increasingly realizing it is actually the pores that are more important to soil health than the aggregates. And and the aggregates are really important. And these things vary from so small you can't even see them, let alone get a hair down them, to big stuff such as worm-sized tubes or holes and pores where there used to be roots that have died off. And so it is this good pore structure, this sponge-like structure, that allows water to get into the soil, to infiltrate and percolate deeper into the soil. And we also colloquially talk about soil needing to breathe. The soil does not breathe like we do with lungs and stuff, but there's lots of organisms in soil. They're aspiring, they're consuming organic matter, taking in oxygen, giving off carbon dioxide, and that air has to be exchanged. Otherwise, the atmosphere in the soil, the air in the soil is going to get saturated with carbon dioxide. So there's constant exchange of air with the atmosphere. And it is a good pore structure that allows that to happen. So physical soil health is really focused around the soil erosion and infiltration, minimizing erosion and maximizing infiltration. And that flows through to minimizing overland flow. And from minimizing overland flow, we reduce all our nutrient pollution, our N, our nitrogen, our P, our phosphorus, the actual physical loss of soil, and microbes such as E. coli. It also maximizes, with all that pore space and good aggregation, on nitrogen and phosphorus holding capacities, and minimizes those losses going through to groundwater, the water table, and into drains. Now, the three key things that really destroy soil structure and soil physical health are a lack of diversity of living plants. I will come back to that as part of this science revolution. The stuff we've known about going back eons, if not going back to the dawn of agriculture, is compaction. In the home garden, from walking on the soil, and in agriculture, from driving tractors on the soil or having livestock walking on the soil, but also cultivation, digging. These things are highly detrimental for physical soil health, so they're what we need to minimize here. Next is chemical soil health. And I come at this from quite a different angle to most other people. All living things, from bacteria to blue whales, have basically the same ratio of nutrients: C carbon, O oxygen, hydrogen, and then nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. If you don't have those things in the right balance, you're going to be unhealthy. And this is the wonderfully named science of stoichiometry. And this is a table of the proportion of nutrients in plants. Plants are almost entirely carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen, 96%. The things we typically think of as fertilizers, particularly in farming, nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, our NPK, is only 3% of a plant's biomass. And this is on a dry mass basis, not a wet basis. Indeed, basic maths tells us that everything apart from carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen must add up to 4%. So all the things we typically think of as fertilizers or nutrients that we apply are in fact a minor proportion of plants. I can definitely assure you carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen are fertilizers, because glasshouse growers will increase the carbon dioxide percentage in their glasshouses from the current 4 parts per million to 9 parts per million to boost crop growth. They are fertilizing with carbon dioxide. Now, the fact that all living things require basically the same ratio of the chemical elements, the nutrients, means when we have the soil nutrients right for our plants, they are right for all soil biology. And there's a key thing here around the macronutrients and the micronutrients. So the macronutrients also used to be called in the old days the major nutrients, and the micronutrients used to be called the trace elements, which was even more confusing than kind of micronutrients are as a name. The key thing here is micronutrients are just as important as macronutrients. They're just required in smaller amounts. And that comes down to old Justus von Liebig's law of the minimum. The growth of a plant or any organism is not determined by the total amount of resources, but the resource that's in the scarcest, the least amount. That is your limiting nutrient. If you are deficient in selenium, it doesn't matter how much extra phosphorus you are taking on. That's not going to fix anything, because it is the selenium that is limiting your growth and the growth of your plants. So we have to get all these staves and Liebig's barrel up to the same level. The confusion here is a lot of people think because the micronutrients are only required in smaller amounts, that they're not as important as the macronutrients, but you are just as dead if you don't have enough selenium as if you don't have enough phosphorus. They're equally important, it's just they're required in different amounts. And globally and in New Zealand, in agriculture, everywhere we have dropped the micronutrient ball. Micronutrient deficiency globally is a massive issue. Billions of people globally are deficient in micronutrients because we focused on fertilizing with NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, a bit of pH, and maybe some sulfur. All this small stuff like selenium and zinc and iodine hasn't been put back onto the land. And now plants are deficient in those, and then if you eat those plants, you become deficient in those. And we have a particular issue in New Zealand. Our soils are low in selenium generally. Our flour is fortified with selenium because of this. So if you're eating bread and flour products milled in New Zealand, they are boosted with selenium. But if you're growing a lot of your own food and you're not eating those foods that are boosted in selenium, and your soil is low in selenium, you may have selenium deficiency and supplements may well be required. So without those right amounts of nutrients, if your soil's deficient in micronutrients, not only are the plants struggling to grow, but so is soil biology. And biology is what makes a soil, so we need the right amounts of nutrients of soil biology to make it healthy. It's that three-legged stool metaphor again. The chemistry is supporting the biology here. So how do you know if you've got the right amounts of nutrients? Well, in agriculture, we do soil tests. We sample some soil and send it off to the laboratory. But for a comprehensive test that's going to test for all the nutrients, including all the micronutrients, is going to set you back $300, which a lot of people, I'm kind of guessing, are starting to suck some air through their teeth at the idea of spending $300. So for most home gardeners, unless you're growing a lot of your own food, it's just not worth it. But I'd suggest if you're at a larger scale, such as lifestyle blocks, and particularly if you're growing food for other people, it's really important you do that soil testing every 2, 3, 4 years to make sure you're not producing and selling food that's deficient in nutrients, particularly micronutrients. And so we come to the third leg of our stool, soil biology. Now, the guys at NASA often bang on about lunar soil or Martian soil. I can assure you there is no soil on Mars or the Moon because there's no life on either of those things. There is only what is called regolith, ground up rock. Soil is fundamentally a living thing. It is alive. And axiomatically, therefore, a healthy soil is a biologically active soil. But something that's active means it's continuously turning over. This isn't a destination. You can't get your soil healthy and then kind of rest on your laurels. This is a continuous endeavor you need to undertake. And this is where this massive soil science revolution has occurred around how soil organic matter forms and what therefore drives soil biology and health. So this is kind of the old model. This is what we used to think. Stuff dies, leaves fall onto the ground, we add compost or manure or other organic amendments. Little organisms break it up into smaller and smaller pieces to the point that the microbes, the fungi and the bacteria can attack it and decompose it back to inorganic mineral forms. We used to think that the simple compounds, sugars, proteins, fats, oils, decomposed really quickly. The more complex stuff, polymers such as cellulose, took weeks to years to decompose. And then the really tough stuff, the woody, the lignified material, took centuries to millennia and became humus. And humus here is using the scientific meaning, is defined as organic matter that is recalcitrant. It resists decay. And everybody is currently rewriting their textbooks. So this is the new model, the new paradigm. Clearly, the old model can't be completely wrong because dead stuff ends up on the surface of soil. It's fragmented by little critters and the microbes hook into it. But this stuff ends up as particulate organic matter with the acronym POM. We used to think this was basically the source of all organic matter in soils, but you now realize that only around 20% of organic matter in soils comes from the decomposition of organic residues such as compost and leaf litter. And even the really tough woody stuff doesn't last very long, just a few years to a few decades, and it's all gone. It's all been mineralized back to inorganic compounds. And humus doesn't exist. This has come as a right old shock to a lot of people, particularly those of us in organics. Many people in organics have considered humus to be the very foundation on which soil health is built. And humus doesn't exist. Quite startling. Indeed, it doesn't actually even make sense because we start off with these big old hunks of organic matter like leaves, little things break them up and the microbes hook into them and they go and they decompose them all the way back to mineral compounds, inorganic compounds. And somewhere along this route of all these molecules getting smaller and smaller and smaller, puff, this great big complex humus molecule appears. And nobody can say what it is about the particular arrangement of carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen in the humus molecules that makes them resist decay compared to all the other carbon, oxygen, hydrogen compounds in the soil that decay quite happily. Indeed, when we look now directly at soil using new scientific techniques such as intense light beams and synchrotrons, we cannot find humus. We now realize that it's an artifact of the alkali chemical extraction methods used last century. Quite astonishing. So the new stuff's over here on the right. Plants put out through their roots between 10 to 40% even more of the photosynthetes they make from sunlight. And these are simple compounds like the sugars, and these feed a vast density and diversity of microbes that live around the plant's roots. And the microbes return the favor by providing the plant with water, nutrients, that's mineral nutrients, and protection from pests and pathogens. Different plant species produce different exudates that feed different microbes. They can even change the exudates they make to favor particular microbes. For example, mycorrhizal fungi, if it's going dry, will give the plant more water. And as this is a percentage of photosynthetes, the more foliage you have on a plant, the more photosynthetes it can make. This is absolutely critically at the heart of this new model and what it means for managing soil health and forming organic matter. So the microbes consume these root exudates, and then the microbes that consume themselves and all the nutrients and energy churn through the soil ecosystem. And they then end up finally within tiny little cracks in soil minerals, particularly inside clays. And this is called mineral-associated organic matter, which has to have one of the most ghastly acronyms I've ever come across, MAOM or MAOM. Nobody can even agree how to pronounce this thing, which is a bit of a shame because it's really important, because 80% of the organic matter in soil is in the form of MAOM. And this is the stuff that now lasts hundreds, thousands of years, not because it's in some weirdo way recalcitrant to further decay, but because it's in such a tiny little crack in such a tiny little soil mineral that even the smallest microbes, such as bacteria, simply cannot get at it to decompose it. So effectively, they are in a sterile environment. And so I came up with a little catchphrase for this new soil model. Humus is dead. Long live Marm. Have a think about it. It works on multiple levels. And I have to say, I was insufferably smug the day I came up with that. So what this means is we've essentially been thinking about plants the wrong way round. You know, high school science, plants take up water and nutrients from their roots and they use it along with sunlight to grow foliage. Yeah, nah. Well, clearly plants take up sunlight, but all that carbon comes out of the atmosphere as carbon dioxide because most carbon compounds, bar a few sugars, are insoluble in water. And if something's insoluble in water, it can't be taken up by plant roots. And as I said before, plants are 45% carbon. That's 45% elemental carbon, not 40% carbon dioxide. So they are absorbing a whacking amount of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. They're also 45% oxygen, which comes from that carbon dioxide as well. And that 6% hydrogen, that also comes from water, H2O, which is coming out of the atmosphere. So most of the biomass of a plant is actually coming out of the atmosphere, not out of the ground. And then they take that carbon dioxide, the carbon, the oxygen, the hydrogen, some of those nutrients like NPK from the ground, combine it with sunlight, and then pump the whole lot underground to feed the soil microbiome. So literally they're pumping stuff into the ground far more than they are taking stuff up out of the ground. And then we come to energy. So this is a much newer kind of concept in soil science. We kind of view the soil somewhat as a kind of static system from the physics and chemistry history. And what I'm talking about here is proper scientific energy, not some kind of weirdo healing energy kind of stuff. We're talking proper watts and joules here. And if you think about it, all the energy that powers the soil ecosystem has to come from photosynthesis because plants are the only autotrophs, the only organisms that can harvest the energy in sunlight through the miracle of photosynthesis. But what's changed here is it's not the fact that that energy is flowing into the soil from the likes of leaf litter or decaying roots. 80% of that energy flows from root exudates being pumped into the soil to feed the microbes and feed the soil ecosystem. So energy, kind of as a very shaky metaphor, is kind of like a glue or the seat on my three-legged stool that binds the physical, chemical, and biological soil healths together. And to give you a straightforward figure, 55 megajoules per meter square per year of energy is input into grassland. 80% of that is from root exudates. Now, unless you happen to have done a lot of physics, 55 megajoules is a completely meaningless figure. So trying to put some kind of measure on it. 1 litre of petrol is 32 megajoules. If you've ever set a litre of petrol alight, you'll realise there's a lot of heat comes off it. Or just think how far 1 litre of petrol will push your internal combustion engine car, which probably weighs a ton or even 3 if you've got a really big SUV kind of thing. So there is a truly gargantuan amount of energy flowing through the soil ecosystem, and it's primarily coming from root exudates. So that brings us to some practical tips for a healthy soil, starting with the physics. Don't compact it, squish it by walking on it. Clearly, you've got to access your garden, just like farmers have got to access their fields, typically by driving tractors over it. But we need to think about how much of the garden we're actually walking over and confine as much as possible to paths. We may be able to support those with some of those concrete blocks with holes in them that allows the lawn to grow through it. Minimize the amount of digging you do. There's a massive thing in organics, or a subsection of organics, that's really been into their no-dig gardening. And in agriculture, we have the equivalent. This is called no-till or direct drilling. We also have minimum till, where we just make shallow surface cultivations instead of kind of really taking a plow to it, or a equivalent would be a big spade and really turning everything over. That's all. That digging is really harmful for soil. And then it's this new soil paradigm. Maximize the diversity of living roots year round. It's living roots that will fundamentally fix bad physical soil health. It's not cultivation and digging. For chemical health, it's somewhat harder. In a perfect world, you'd all have lots of money. You can send soil samples off to the lab testing on a regular basis. That's probably not practical for most people, and especially with a small garden, it's probably not warranted. So pH tests, test kits from garden centres or the hardware store. Typically, what happens for most people in home gardens is they're over fertilizing, not only with mineral fertilizers, but with the likes of compost and manure. And when you over fertilize, typically your pH goes up. So if your pH, unless you're already on an alkaline soil, is on the sevens or the eights, that's highly likely to indicate that you have been over fertilizing, and you can simply stop putting fertilizer and compost and manure onto the garden, probably for a decade or 5. Really long times, this stuff will last. You've also got general observations of plant health. Have you got nice, healthy looking plants, or are they showing signs of chlorosis? This may be indicating a deficiency. It's often indicating an induced deficiency where there's so much of one nutrient, it's stopping the uptake of another nutrient and causing that other nutrient to become deficient. So, simple rule here for a healthy soil in terms of nutrients, don't over apply them, either as mineral fertilizers or organic materials like compost. For your veggie plots, if you've got a really productive veggie plot, you're harvesting lots of onions and potatoes, salads really got no nutrients in them at all. They're mostly water and fiber. 25 grams of compost per meter squared per year is a lot. If you've got some bare soil and you sprinkle 50 grams of compost over a square meter, you will not be able to see it. If you sprinkle compost on the ground and you can see it, you're probably getting closer to 50. Sorry, I always work in tons here. It'll be the equivalent of 50 tons a hectare. We are talking a lot. So divide 50 tons by 10,000, and that'll tell you how much a square meter. For things like your borders or your lawn, if you're mulching your clippings back in, 10 grams a square meter per year is probably heaps as well. So a healthy soil in terms of soil biology, get your physical and chemical soil health right, and then get lots of energy flowing through your soil by maximizing the diversity and biomass of plant species. In short, we can boil everything down to this very simple statement. If you want to maximize soil health, what you need is a diversity of living plant roots year round, coupled with as much foliage as possible to maximize the amount of root exudates going into that ground through those roots. This is kind of the insanity of it all. Mary, I heard you in the introduction saying the article was quite technical. I'm kind of going, boy, oh boy, you should read some of the scientific publications I read. I can barely make sense of them. So the level of understanding, that scientific understanding of soil in all its dimensions now is truly colossal. Unbelievable levels of technical understanding. And it always boils back down to this simple statement: a diversity of living plant roots year round is what will drive your soil health. It's kind of slightly frustratingly simple. It's so simple. It'd be nice kind of almost to have a complicated answer, but the answer isn't complicated. It's really, really simple. So thank you very much for that. And we can take some questions and any discussions.
Anyone got questions? I guess it takes a little bit of absorbing that information. Here I'm sitting thinking about my veggie garden.
Yep.
And the lack of diversity, where you put in mass amounts of one type of planting, and that's sort of been our heritage, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is the thing. This new soil science is really upending. Just actually talking to some farmers today, comments on YouTube, where they do a fallow for a year and a half in the dry parts of the American Midwest to grow one crop of wheat every 2 years. And so I pointed this issue out to them, the fact that they've got bare soil for a year and a half of the year and what that's doing to their soil health. And they said, yeah, why are we doing what we're doing? This idea of a fallow of bare soil, even resting the soil from being exploited by plants growing in it, goes back to probably Roman times, if not before. There's all this bare soil and monoculture cropping has a really long history. There was actually a time in Ireland where farmers started raking soil together and burning it with piles of wood, which was incredibly destructive. They had to pass a law to stop people doing it and send the police round. But this is what this new science is telling us, is all that bare soil is basically, it's lacking those root exudates, all those nutrient inputs, all the carbon inputs, all the energy inputs. That soil's literally dying. So what we've seen in agriculture, particularly in the regenerative farming space, where they've been given this new science as it's evolving, they've become really fanatical about their multi-species cover crops. And they may have a break, say, between harvesting a cereal in January and planting the next one in, say, end of March. They would have just left that soil bare in the past. They're now putting cover crops on it, and we can detect scientifically the difference in soil health from having that land covered compared to bare. And then kind of coming back to your monocultures, yeah, we've been doing this for generations and generations, and monoculture is primarily the product of intensive agriculture coming out of the post-Second World War and the Green Revolution and maximizing yield. The problem is it's just one species of plant. So all the microbes that want exudates from other plants are starving. So what we're increasingly doing is starting to look at this and kind of go, we have to move away from monocultures and start intercropping. And intercropping is simply the opposite of monoculture. It's growing two or more species of plant together. In a very simple example, you're growing some cabbages. They need to be on a big wide spacing because they get very big. So instead of just planting the cabbages and having lots of bare soil and weeding it all the time and hoeing it, you plant some lettuces in between the cabbages, and they grow quicker than the cabbages. So they're harvested by the time the cabbages are starting to close the space up. And then you plant some radishes or something else really quick growing between the lettuces. So what you're doing is intercropping. So you're constantly turning over your crops, and instead of kind of harvesting everything, digging everything over, and then planting something else, we're kind of doing kind of more of a patchwork quilt approach to gardening. It's literally, oh, that lettuce is ready for harvesting. We'll harvest it and we'll plant something directly back in the space where it's come from. The challenges and the square foot gardening technique, if you've heard of that, I can't remember the name of the guy that developed it. It's basically enabled this intercropping approach by basically saying how many square feet any particular plant needs to kind of simplify this process. But there's lots of others out there as well.
Okay, yeah, a good question. Why is digging bad?
It destroys soil structure. Can you imagine putting a sponge in a blender, in a kitchen blender? That's what digging does to your soil. So that's simple enough answer. So it breaks up all the pore spaces. And it takes quite a considerable time for the soil microbes, larger organisms like worms, plant roots to grow and die to reform that pore structure. The challenge is if your soil has become compacted, stopping compacting it, just waiting for soil biology to fix it, particularly if it's badly compacted, is going to take a considerable time. So both in home gardening and farming, coming in with some steel, as we like to call it, some cultivation, some digging to ameliorate that severe compaction. But then the only way to properly fix that compaction is to get some diversity of living roots in it again. So basically grow stuff and let it get big.
Okay. Yep.
There are cover crops, so like legumes and mushrooms on. Had to dig it in.
Yeah, so the question is, if you are putting in your crops, how do you put them in if we're not doing digging? Is that your question, Dennis? No. Oh, things like lupus. So your larger items.
Yeah, look, root crops, this kind of stuff, kind of hits the wall in terms of root crops. Virtually all of the in commercial production, there's no tillage or reduced tillages in arable crops, things like wheat and barley and oats. They're strong, big crops, and we're not harvesting the roots, so they can penetrate, that denser soil that you get when you stop digging. But once you start getting into things like root crops such as such as carrots and potatoes, to some extent you invariably have to disturb the soil. You have to get a carrot out of the ground, you have to dig it. You can grow potatoes no dig. If you get a really thick layer of mulch, particularly something like baleage or silage that's been fermented, and so it resists being decayed because it is fermented. And maybe you put a 20 centimeter, put your potatoes on the soil surface and put that thick mulch over it. They'll do really well in that situation, and they're really easy to harvest because you just peel the mulch back and all the potatoes are growing on that interface between soil. But certainly for vegetable growing, a lot of the time there's very few vegetable growers in the no-till space. It's just too hard for them. Particularly small-seeded stuff, they're seeding a lot of small-seeded crops directly into the ground, and if the ground's too hard, their drills simply won't work. So there are challenges to this, but it's kind of don't let the perfect get in the way of good. Reducing the amount of digging you're doing, reducing the amount of bare soil you've got, this is all going to help, even if it's not kind of perfect.
So if we're harvesting things like our broccoli or whatever, we're slicing it off at the base rather than pulling out the plant.
Yeah. Yeah, look, and I mean, just leaving the residues, a lot of the, organics, we've always had this big thing about composting. And, even going back to the previous model, I've looked at all this composting and going, I can't see the point of this. In a natural ecosystem, plants grow, they die, all their above ground residues ends up on the soil surface where microbes and worms and springtails and who knows what else hook into it and decompose it. So if you want to drive the total soil ecosystem, leaving all those residues in place is far better than cleaning everything off and chucking it in the compost heap. And I'm also a lazy bugger. So I kind of go, well, I've got to cart all this stuff all the way to the compost heap and then cart all the compost all the way back. I'm too lazy. I'm just going to let it all sit here on the ground. Clearly, if you're limited for space, that's an issue. In some of our really intense urban market gardens, they've got tiny amounts of land and they're growing huge amounts of stuff. So they have to clear stuff away, put it in a compost heap. So they've got the clear ground to put new stuff into. So, but again, don't let the perfect get in the way of good.
Yeah. Is that a question?
Yes, I was going to say, I think what we were talking about was these chop and drop crops.
Yeah.
Like that put nitrogen into the ground.
RHS is that.
Yeah.
RHS, it's chop and drop. And you bring it
chop and drop, apart from being a bit of a tongue twister. Yeah, exactly. That's what's going on here. And to preempt the slug question, yes, one of your problems if you're chopping and dropping a whole load of green leafy material is you're creating slug haven. So, if you were going to plant something that's, slugs have got no interest in at all, and I'm definitely trying to rack my brains here, but what you're probably not wanting to do is chop, drop, and then plant a whole load of lettuces, because the slugs are really going to hammer those lettuces. We do now have iron phosphate based slug pellets that are certified organic. Iron phosphate is actually a food ingredient, so compared to the synthetic chemical slug baits, which are really very toxic and very bad for the environment, these iron phosphate ones are better. So we do have a new tool in our toolbox for controlling slugs in these kind of higher residue systems.
Are those slug baits, are that the ones you were talking about, are they available in the garden centres now?
Yes, I think it's the I won't try and say the brand. I've got a pack here, so I bought the stuff in the garden centre here myself. And you basically look and it will say iron based or iron phosphate. If it says methaldehyde, run screaming.
Okay, that's a handy hint. Anyone else with any questions?
and get selenium into the soil if we're short of it.
So there are selenium-based fertilizers. They're generally only available commercially, as far as I know. And the challenge here is one of the things with the micronutrients is not only are they required in small amounts, but the amount in soil, the difference between going from being deficient to being excess and potentially toxic is really a very small amount. For the macronutrients, you've got a much wider range of levels of nutrients in the soil where it goes from suboptimum to optimum and stays optimum for a long time, and then it becomes toxic. So if you are thinking about applying selenium or other micronutrients, you really have to get a soil test and get good quality advice on how much fertilizer you need to apply to rectify those deficiencies. And kind of one of the good advantages of using biological organic fertilizers like compost or manure, because of their origin, they generally have the full range of micronutrients in them. You know, if the compost has been made from something that comes from somewhere that's really deficient in the micronutrient, it'll still be deficient. You know, but something like your green waste compost from urban composting that comes from your wheelie bins originally, that's got lots and lots of stuff mixed into it. So inherently, when you apply something like compost, you're getting all those trace nutrients along with your major nutrients as well as all the organic matter.
By adding a compost maker powder to the compost, am I doing things incorrectly?
What are you saying? You're adding what to the compost?
Buy from the garden centre this compost maker encouraged us, I suppose, that you do 3 layers of assorted greenery or twigs. Then you put a layer of this white canvas and water, and then you do it all repeat again.
Right. I vaguely got half of that. It seemed to be about layering compost.
It's adding a compost enhancer powder to the compost.
Yeah, virtually the scientific studies looking at those compost enhancers, stuff like the old Garrotta and stuff like that, they've all been found wanting. Basically, as long as you have the right balance of nutrients, particularly carbon and hydrogen in the material you're making the compost from, and you mix it up, so it's mixed up, compost will grow perfectly fine. Most of those additives are a complete waste of money. So we can save you some money there to spend on your chemical soil tests.
By a trace element,
Yeah.
right, we could put like half a teaspoon over a metre of soil. I would presume that would probably have your selenium and things like that in it.
So I missed that.
You can buy trace element fertilizer additive.
Okay, yeah. I mean,
So
I'd have to look at the specific thing, but if it says it's a trace element fertilizer additive, then I would assume that it has all the trace elements in it in their correct ratios. The challenge there is your soil may be low, for example, in selenium, but it may be really high in iodine. So you're putting enough of this fertilizer on for selenium, but you're making your iodine even higher. And so this is the challenge there with these kind of generic fertilizers. And again, you know, you kind of your lawn fertilizers or your vegetable fertilizers, there's a lot of assumptions sitting underneath the amounts of nutrients in those things and the rates that you apply them. And the main thing fertilizer companies want you to do is buy more fertilizer because that's how they make money. So, you know, in the commercial situation, there's a lot of restraints now on fertilizer companies pushing unnecessary limits, amounts of nutrients onto farmers. You know, we have various regional council plans and requirements, but for the home gardeners, it's open slather. You know, the guys will just try and push fertilizers on you as hard as they can. And most of the time, you don't need them.
Oh, this is sounding great. Yes.
It's to do with a heavy clay soil.
Did you get that? What do we do with a heavy clay soil?
Move house.
You'd have to move it.
Your challenge with any kind of soil texture, whether it's really sandy or really clayey, is you can't change soil texture easily. You literally have to import, you know, probably 100 kilograms of the opposite soil type. So if you've got a really clayey soil, you'd need to have to import, you know, 100 kilos of sand per square meter to really shift the dial on your soil texture. So the main way of fixing it is, guess what? Living roots year round. It's literally, you know, getting the plants in there, letting them grow as big as possible, getting their roots down as deep. And it's potentially, if you've kind of moved on to somewhere, you know, it's a new subdivision, they've completely munted the soil by bulldozing it all around and then compacting it and then chucking a bit of topsoil back on top. You're looking at 5 years of having lots of nice lush growth, and particularly pasture. And this is something I haven't touched on before. Perennial species put about 2/3 of their photosynthesis, they put, sorry, 2/3 more photosynthesates as exudates into the ground than annual plants do. And annual plants' evolutionary objective is to be a seed. So they actually produce as little roots as possible to produce the seeds they want to produce. And therefore, they're often only in the ground for a few months. They only live for a few months, most annual plants. And so they don't have a need to make lots of friends with their microbe mates. They can kind of give them a bit of exudate so they get a bit of a hand, but they're all just focused on growing seeds. Where perennial species like pasture species, grasses and clovers and forbs, herbs, they're there for several years. They're the opposite of the fly-by-night or white van guy. So they need to make lots of friends underground. They need to look after their microbial mates. So they put a lot of exudates in the ground. So if you're really wanting to fix ground up, by far the best and one of the cheapest things you can do is sow a really good diverse pasture and walk away. Because every time you mow it, you're removing photosynthetic leaf area. That's the reason, it's one of the reasons why soils under lawns are often so stuffed. Aside from all the walking over, basically we keep taking away all the photosynthetic area of all the leaves, so they can produce very little photosynthate, so they can produce very little exudates, so there's very few microbes. If you let that pasture just grow to its full height and just leave it, it'll produce a ton of exudates. Indeed.
Becoming better and better. We don't have to
Yeah,
spend
a quick estimate. If you've got a really good, vigorous pasture, it can be producing 10 tons of exudates per hectare. Divide by 10,000 again. So we are talking very large amounts of weight, of mass, volume, whatever, of exudates going into the soil. Far more than we can apply as compost or any of these biological fertilizer products or biostimulants or whatever. And the microbes have evolved with the plants to consume the exudates. So those exudates are perfect microbe food. So save your money on all those soil additives that talk about improving your soil biology and all the rest of it. Most of them are snake oil. The most effective way is living roots year round.
We don't have a crop of ryegrass or carrots or anything. How's our biomass, how's our soil affected by these different kinds of plants?
So the question is, if we're looking at, we're all gardeners, and a lot of it is, our countryish gardens. So we've got trees and shrubs and annuals. Am I right, Margaret? You're asking, is that diversity sufficient?
Yep. I mean, in terms of that diversity, that kind of bucolic cottage garden, with kind of almost random mosaic of trees and shrubs, and then the shorter perennial species, and then getting down to the annuals in the veggie plot. That's a lot of biodiversity. It'll be the veggie plot that has the least biodiversity. But think about a tree. A tree's a big thing. That's an awful lot of leaves, and that's an awful lot of photosynthesis, and it is pumping a huge amount of exudates into the soil. The kind of antithesis of what we want in terms of soil health and biodiversity generally is these kind of modern geometric gardens that are mostly, covered surfaces. In soil science, we talk about soil sealing, where the soil is covered by a driveway or a flagstone or, a roadway or a path or a building or anything like that. All those soils under that, under those permanent coverings, the soil's dying. So, this modern thing with pathways and then gravel sitting on top of weed matting and then a few bonsai type plants in topiary shrubs and planters and stuff. Oh dear, I'm sorry. God, I hate that. That's the complete opposite of what we need for, addressing our environmental challenges and soil health. So we really need to move back to the old cottage garden kind of approach for both biodiversity and soil health.
Here we go. We're doing something right.
So I hope I haven't sold too many people there.
In the housing, there's a whole city which had one house and shrubs and trees and that,
Mm.
there's now 6 townhouses coming in the entire section.
We're just getting lamenting on the infill housing.
We're horrified.
Yeah, from the social political side, I can see where that's coming from, but from a soil health, that's the kind of wrong direction. What we want is houses with tiny little footprints. So, build them taller, surrounded by nice big gardens with lots of diverse plants growing in it, and tiny little pathways to go through and wander through and enjoy it all. Of course, we have to have a few lawns for the kids to play footy on and stuff. So, the good and the perfect and all that.
Are there any other questions? Well, can't thank you enough, Charles. Sorry about the hiccups in the very beginning, and thank you for your patience. I was sort of thinking through, it would be good to reiterate to you the parts of what you taught us that reverberated most with me, but there was so much. I don't know that I could do that, but I'm sure I speak for the others that we appreciate the analogies to things like the three-legged stool and the barrel with the cuts out in the water, and it made it so much more understandable. And I've definitely found that easy to follow. So thank you, compared to the article in the NZ Gardener magazine. And gosh, from this moment forward, I think a lot of us will think a little differently in the way we do things.
Very good. So glad to hear it. And thank you very much for asking me to come and talk to you.
Thank you for giving up your time.
Very good. Have a good evening, everybody.